From Software, especially nowadays, is one of the most revered and respected AAA studios out there, and for good reason. Miyazaki's Souls games, consisting of Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring, are all fantastic games in their own right, except for Dark Souls 2, but that's a whole other can of worms. Formula for their games has been, for the most part, iterative, the focus being on making variations on a theme, which allows From Software to really refine and experiment with this formula to try and perfect it down to its core. Demon Souls was their experimental first foray into what would end up being dubbed the Souls-like genre. Dark Souls was the solidification of the core idea of the series, and it saw much more mainstream success than its predecessor. Dark Souls 2 was a step back in a lot of ways, but From Software quickly redeemed themselves by shortly after releasing Bloodborne, which is now widely considered to be From Software's best game and is in many people's top 10 video games of all time, assuming they've actually gotten to play it. Bloodborne was revolutionary for the Souls series, and yes, I'm going to refer to From Software's games of this type as Souls games because it's simply easier. Bloodborne made everything more relentlessly fast and aggressive. There were two shields that were technically in the game, but they honestly might as well have not even been there at all, as they were rendered basically unusable by the pace of Bloodborne's combat. The game encouraged trading damage due to the rally mechanic, which allowed you to temporarily regain lost health by attacking. Dark Souls 3 returned most of the classic elements that comprised the first two games, but the pace of the combat was sped up more akin to Bloodborne because Miyazaki realized that slow and methodical combat was for 36-year-old virgins who still like to breastfeed. Elden Ring is a whole different game in its own right, but I'll bring that up later. There's another game in From Software's catalog. The biggest deviation in the Souls-like formula, to the point where it's debatable if it's even really a Souls-like game at all. Sekiro is the most refined and focused game that FromSoft has ever made, and stands in stark contrast to all their other Souls games. It is simultaneously the best game that FromSoft has ever made, and also the most forgotten. Sekiro, off the bat, differs from every other Souls game in a very major way. It stars a named protagonist. While the Chosen Undead, the Ashen One, and the Tarnished are mostly defined by what you envision them to be and the endings that you choose in their respective games, Sekiro is very much his own person with his own goals. Sekiro roughly translates to one-armed wolf, so I'll be referring to him as Wolf for the rest of the video. Wolf was found by Owl, a great shinobi. Owl decided to take the young Wolf in when he didn't flinch from his sword. He is Wolf's adopted father, and he indoctrinated Wolf into what's called the Iron Code, which states that the father's word is absolute, which is to say Owl himself, and Wolf's master is his second, Wolf's master being decided by Owl. This gives Owl total control over Wolf, and the master that is assigned to Wolf is the divine heir, a young boy named Kuro. The opening cutscene establishes Owl and Wolf's connection, and it also shows the battle between Isshin, Ashina, and General Tamura. In this battle, Isshin ends up coming out the victor. This preceded the rise of the Ashina clan, led by Isshin, and it solidified his reputation as the Sword Saint. After Wolf was assigned as Kuro's protector, he was abandoned by his father, and he lost his master, which, like I said, is Kuro. If it sounds like I'm glossing over this, it's because the game also glosses over this so that it can be explained more later, and I plan to follow suit. The game starts with a mysterious woman dropping a note down to the downtrodden Wolf, having failed in his mission, the contents of which lead him to Kuro's location. This beginning and combat-free segment is pretty short, but it introduces two new mechanics: eavesdropping and stealth. Eavesdropping allows you to listen in on enemy conversations, which is useful for maybe warning you about what's ahead or providing some more context to whatever situation you and the enemy find yourselves in. Stealth isn't necessarily unheard of in Souls games, but it's far more fleshed out with Sekiro. There's tall grass you can hide in, as well as a dedicated crouch button. It's not the deepest stealth system there is by any means, but it works well enough to support the rest of the game. After this, you find Kuro, who bequeaths to you Kisabi Maru, which is Wolf's sword, and he assigns you to essentially find a secret path out of Ashina Castle. Also, I'm sure I'm probably fucking butchering this pronunciation, but I don't speak Japanese, so I apologize. After this, the game introduces you to the combat, which is undoubtedly the best part of this game and is probably the best combat system in all of the Souls games. Bloodborne took the classic Souls combat loop and it sped it up considerably. Sekiro, in addition to changing a few of the core fundamentals like health, dodging, and blocking, speeds it up even further. Sekiro is the hardest Souls game to learn in terms of combat, but paradoxically, it's also the simplest out of all the Souls games. Most of the combat loop can be summed down to two actions: attacking and deflecting. Attacking is, well, as it sounds, but deflecting is a higher skill cap alternative to just blocking. By raising your block right when the enemy's attack lands, you can perform a deflect, which both protects your posture bar and inflicts progress on the enemy's posture bar. Oh, before I go on, posture. You and all your opponents have an orange posture bar in addition to a normal health bar, and you can fill up that posture bar by attacking and deflecting, and your opponents can do the same to you. When an enemy's posture bar is broken, they become susceptible to a death blow, which is signified by a little red dot hovering over your enemy, where you can perform a unique animation and annihilate one of their health bars if they have more than one. Because of this, posture is far more important than health in Sekiro, although health still plays a role. See, posture bars, both yours and your enemies, will refill indefinitely, which helps push you to be aggressive as to not give your enemies a chance to recover. The more vitality or health damage you inflict to someone, the longer it will take for their posture bar to regenerate. And that goes for you too. Once you've inflicted sufficient vitality damage to an enemy, you'll be allotted much larger windows to back off and recover yourself without losing the progress you've made towards breaking your enemy's posture. This system encourages aggression, but not necessarily in the same way that Bloodborne does. While Bloodborne does award you for consistently attacking, it doesn't necessarily punish you for backing off as long as you're smart about it. Sekiro is different. If you back off without having dealt a sufficient amount of vitality damage, you will literally lose progress you've made in a fight. Granted, your opponent does too, but your opponent's an AI and they're not getting worn out like you are. Combat in Sekiro is a fight of endurance, and the bosses and mini-bosses of the game require your absolute undivided attention if you want to take them down. You can R1 spam through some of the more common enemies, but it really isn't the norm for the most part. After this, you make your way to the secret exit with Kuro, but as you're going to leave, you run into Genichiro Ashina, Ishin's adopted grandson. Now, you technically can beat Genichiro here, but it's pretty unlikely this early on. His movement isn't too complex compared to some of the later bosses and enemies in the game, but this early on, you're probably gonna die. This is expected, however, it's kind of a FromSoft staple. Wolf fumbles when he goes to draw his sword, which shows how out of practice he is. Wolf's sword skills, which is directly tied to your skills as a player with the game's mechanics, will also be directly tied to his character development. But that's something to go in later when it's more fleshed out and we can talk about the ludonarrative harmony that exists in this game. Win or lose this fight, Wolf loses his arm, and Kuro gets captured by Genichiro, and then Wolf wakes up in a dilapidated old temple next to a raggedy old man carving a Buddha statue. The man explains that he replaced Wolf's severed arm with a prosthetic one, which can be fitted with shinobi tools such as shurikens and firecrackers. Shinobi tools are one of the few genuine customization options in this game, and almost all of them are designed with a specific purpose in mind. Firecrackers are particularly good against beasts, and the shurikens are good against dogs and Lady Butterfly, for example. But for now, you haven't found any tools to fit into your arm yet. Your prosthetic also comes with a grappling hook, which is a good segue into Sekiro's movement system. Get it? It's much more dynamic and vertical than all the other movement systems in the other Souls games, and it works in concert with the stealth system to allow you to drop in for stealth kills, which can allow you to pick a few enemies off a patrol or even shave a health bar off a mini boss. The movement in the game is fast but smooth, and even though Elden Ring later on has this too, a dedicated jump button adds some of that aforementioned verticality that you can use in combat. The old man, named Sekijo, tells Wolf that Genichiro plans to use Kuro's divine blood for his own gain. Now, the reason for this is that Kuro's blood can grant immortality, which we'll get into later. After this, you enter the first area of the game, the Ashina outskirts. In terms of the map, Sekiro feels much more localized than the other Souls games. This is a positive thing, because the area design had to be rethought to complement Sekiro's more dynamic movement system, as well as allotting space for stealth-focused terrain like tall grass, so you'll find that the areas in the game are much more open than previous games. Not all areas are like this, but it's a mostly uniform change with the exception of a few indoor areas like Ashina Castle. The enemies are more spread out, the progression is more linear than games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne, and it's structured more like an actual level by level design as opposed to the general non-linearity of the prior titles. This isn't a criticism, I actually think it works out pretty well. It allows enemies to be properly separated by segments, meaning that stealth killing or revealing your presence in one segment generally won't alert enemies in the next segment. You're introduced to your first real mini-boss, and he helps introduce you to another core mechanic of Sekiro's new combat, perilous attacks. Perilous attacks are essentially special moves that require a specific input to either deal with or take advantage of. These include thrusts, sweeps, and grabs, although this mini-boss in particular only introduces you to the two former, since grabs were just introduced game-wise in the previous segment with the Chained Ogre. I said earlier that Sekiro's combat was the simplest of all the Souls games, but perilous attacks are what add complications and honestly make that rather blanket statement a bit more debatable. You can counter thrusts as long as you have unlocked the Makiri counter in your samurai skill tree, which at this point in the game is pretty likely. Pulling off a Makiri counter damages the enemy's posture, and it will also allow you to get a couple free licks in if you're fast enough. Sweeps are, as they sound, attacks with a very wide cone that can be jumped over, which leaves the enemy vulnerable to a jumping attack. Overall, the outskirts are a solid opening area, but they are nowhere near the heights of places like Central Yarnum or the Undead Burg. This leads into Gyobu Masataka Oniwa, the game's first boss. Let's talk bosses. While Dark Souls 3 has the highest highs of the series, I'd actually argue that Sekiro has the best boss roster overall in terms of quality. Gyobu might be the finest first boss in the series, although I could easily see Yudex Gundyr also taking that spot. Gyobu is definitely a challenge the first time around, since it's unlikely you're completely accustomed to Sekiro's combat at this point, and he's no slouch when it comes to testing the player. He has 2 health bars and off-kilter attack timings, but this is pretty well balanced out by the wide breaks he gives you and a relatively forgiving posture regeneration. And he looks so cool. Other standout bosses include the True Corrupted Monk, Genichiro Ashina, both versions of Owl, and both versions of Ishin. And as an addendum to this section about bosses, let me cover the game's approach to balance and difficulty real quick. So, Souls games are known for their difficulty, but if I'm being honest, I think that part of their reputation is kind of overblown. For the most part, you can level your character and adjust modifiers to kind of make the game easier on yourself, in addition to summoning, both for players and NPCs. The reality is that while the games don't have an easy mode, like a button you press in the menu, they have a variety of mechanical options that can make the game easier for players individually. Sekiro took one look at that and said, "No! Fuck you!" Sekiro removed the character building RPG elements that defined its peers. This is one of the many effects of the fact that Sekiro now has a named protagonist. Sekiro demands perfection, and I almost mean that literally. The very nature of deflecting is something that can be perfected, and the few ways that the game has to modify the difficulty only reinforce the demand to meet the game's high standards. While there aren't any ways to make Sekiro easier, there are ways to make it harder. The first is the Demon Bell. Once you find it, you can ring it at any point in your playthrough to make the enemies scale higher and therefore do more damage. You can also turn it off. If I'm being honest though, this doesn't really make the game that much more difficult. As I've already stated, health is kind of a secondary metric in Sekiro, so taking like, I think it's 20% more damage from enemies doesn't really change anything. I literally rang the bell my first playthrough without realizing what the hell it did, and I didn't even realize that it made the game harder until after I beat it and I decided to look it up. The more effective option for upping the difficulty is Kuro's Charm. This option is only for New Game Plus runs, but it gives you the option to give Kuro his charm back. This makes it so that you'll take damage even blocking, which means that you have to perfectly parry every enemy if you don't want to take damage. Well, the Demon Bell didn't really make a noticeable difference. Giving Kuro his charm back is fucking brutal. I've tried to play through the game without the charm a couple times, and the farthest I ever got was True Corrupted Monk. Like, it's really hard. All of the Souls games handle difficulty differently, but Sekiro locks it in and restricts it. The variation in player experience is at its lowest in Sekiro, and there aren't really any ways to break the game or cheese bosses most of the time. This isn't a criticism, by the way, it's just me trying to explain why Sekiro's approach to the formula is so unique. In terms of formula, it's easier for me, I find, to visualize the differences in FromSoft's games. Picture Demon's Souls, and everything that it introduced as a nice metal ingot. Nice and simple, not a tool in and of itself, but a great template to be crafted and molded to suit different purposes. Dark Souls took that ingot and made it into a short sword. Easy to use, not too heavy, good for most situations, has good attack and defense, and not particularly specialized. Overall, just a solid weapon, not too specific of a weapon, but it doesn't want to be or need to be. Bloodborne turned that same metal into a big fucking axe, a weapon that is meant to cleave through your enemies with reckless abandon. Powerful, simple, and violent. A weapon that is designed mostly for offense and is extremely effective when combined with aggression. Sekiro took that ingot and it did something weird with it. It made a poisonous needle. It takes great skill to use it properly. It is designed to do one very specific thing, and it does that thing very, very well in the right hands. You also wouldn't really expect somebody to make a needle out of a metal ingot, which fits because Sekiro was kind of an unexpected turn for From Software. Elden Ring takes that same metal ingot, smashes it into pieces, turns those pieces into buckshot, and fires it into a crowd of civilians. Whereas Sekiro is all about precision and specialization, Elden Ring is unfocused and unrestrictive, with little to no limitations on player freedom or discrepancy. I'm not using this image as a criticism of any of these games, I'm just trying to illustrate the differences between them in a comprehensive way. The next major difference in Sekiro compared to the rest of the Souls games is in its storytelling. And with that, let's talk about that. Sekiro's story is much more direct than the rest of FromSoft's games, and once again, this is another effect of using a named protagonist. So I'm going to summarize it for you. I'm not going to go play by play like I did with the whole beginning part, because if I did that, we'd be here for well over 4 hours. As I explained in the opening, Wolf is assigned by Owl to guard Kuro, the divine heir. Kuro is at the Hirata estates, the Hirata being to the Ashina family what FromSoft is to Bandai Namco, or what Britain is to America, a puppet state. Wolf returns to find the estate burning and is shish kebabbed by an above average sized sword. Kuro, deciding that he can't throw away such loyalty, decides to use his powers to make Wolf immortal using the blood of the divine dragon. This is important as it not only explains why you can die more than once, but it's also the only time that Kuro actually gives his blood to somebody else willingly. and Wolf didn't expect it or ask for it. This leads into the game where all that shit I talked about earlier happens. The segment I just talked about takes place in a little side content area that's completely optional. It contains a decent boss and it's a good area, but it's optional overall, but it's nice for understanding the story. Wolf makes his way to Ashina Castle and fights Genichiro again, and this time he'll be using the lightning of his master Tomoe in the third phase, which is where the game teaches you how to do lightning reversals. Genichiro is used throughout this game to show both your growth as a player and Wolf's growth as a shinobi, which, as I mentioned earlier, are one and the same, as his sword draw at the beginning of this fight is much calmer and steadier than it was the first time you met. This is called ludonarrative harmony. And no, I am not just using that term to sound smart, because if I'm being honest, I don't think ludonarrative dissonance is that big of a problem to begin with, but I still think it's commendable how well Sekiro ties gameplay and story together. It might surprise you to find how much easier Genichiro seems than when you first fought him. Obviously, you now have access to things like mid-air attacks and the Makiri counter, but it's a nice progression both of gameplay and narrative. You beat Genichiro, but he decides not to die and leaves. Kuro talks with Wolf and tells him that he wants to sever the dragon's heritage so that no more blood will be spilled in the name of immortality. After this, Emma, the lady you've been using to upgrade your gourd this whole time, tells you that she is a doctor in the service of Ishin Ashina, so naturally you go talk to him. He gives you sake and tells you about the mortal blade, which could be used to sever the dragon's heritage. Wolf goes to Senpo Temple in search of the blade and finds out that the monks there were up to some freaky ass shit. They were trying to create their own divine child, and while they did succeed, all but one of the children died in the process. Wolf makes his way into the folding screen, which is kind of like a limbo dimension to the best of my understanding, and in here are the folding screen monkeys, which are one of the very few lackluster bosses in Sekiro. It's a nice puzzle the first time around though. After killing fucking Alvin and the chimpanzees, Sekiro finally gets to meet the result of the monk's experiments. The survivor is the divine child of the rejuvenating waters, who is in possession of the mortal blade. She tells you that anybody who unsheaths the mortal blade and lives can take it. Wolf unsheaths it and dies, but once he finishes his Windows reboot, he gets back up and takes it. The divine child is quite impressed with Wolf's processing speed, so she agrees to help sever the dragon's heritage. Wolf returns to Kuro to show him his new dark saber, and then Kuro directs him to the Sunken Valley. The Sunken Valley contains two bosses that are required to progress the game: Corrupted Monk and Guardian Ape. Corrupted Monk is deep down in the Mibu village, which is revealed by killing a Miss Noble in the illusory forest. There's also Orin, but she's a mini-boss and therefore not worthy of my mention. The monk is a prelude to my personal favorite boss in the game, has only one health bar, but to balance that, a criminally fast posture regeneration. Killing the monk opens up a key item and a location that is used to access a later area. Then there's the Guardian Ape. Generally, you actually fight the Guardian Ape first, but I saved it for second because I have more to say about it. Guardian Ape is a boss that I like, I think. I'm not a fan of the first phase if I'm being honest. Only the hottest takes here. It feels more like a Bloodborne boss than a Sekiro boss. It feels weird to deflect it, it farts and shits on you to poison you, and it has a grab with inconsistent tracking, but who knows, maybe I just have a skill issue. Now, the second phase, I really like. It's a nice surprise to sweep the rug out from under you when you think that you've won. It has an unnaturally serpentine moveset to emphasize the centipede controlling the ape's body, and it feels nice to deflect it since it's actually using a weapon. Overall, I'd say I like this boss a lot more when I'm not fighting it. Don't worry though, it'll come back. Once you've beaten the monk and the most civilized British person, you return to find Owl hanging out at Ashina Castle. Now, if you've played through the Hirata Estate area, this might catch you off guard since Owl appeared to die in that section of the game. That section takes place 3 years before the game, and I'm not really going to go too deep into it. You are given the option by Owl to either stay loyal to Kuro or to obey the Iron Code and forsake your young master. Now, the bad ending is following the Iron Code, obviously. It leads to a fight with Emma and Ishin in which you kill both of them and then are consumed by Shura, the flames of hatred. If you remain loyal to Kuro, however, Owl attacks you, and it really shows how little he thinks of Wolf. Wolf was never really his son, he was a tool. The reason that Owl assigned Wolf to guard Kuro in the first place was so he could get the dragon's blood for himself. Owl will fight dirty. He throws firecrackers and poison, he drops smoke bombs, and he pretends to give up in between phases. He, much like you, is a shinobi, and a shinobi knows the difference between honor and victory. Regardless, you kill his ass and you inform Kuro of your progression in the Sunken Valley. Now you can step into the wedding tent past the corrupted monk, where a giant rope person will pick you up and carry you off to the divine realm. Fun fact, this is a giant representation of what's called a shimenawa, a special length of rope that's used in Shinto shrines and torii gates, and are believed to ward off evil spirits. Just a cool bit of trivia. This takes you to the true corrupted monk boss fight, which is undoubtedly my favorite boss in the entire game. Beautiful arena set high in the sky with the colors, the creepy ass mask that the monk wears, and the haunting sight of a once righteous and divine being corrupted by immortality. It uses many of the moves from the previous corrupted monk fight, but it has 3 phases, with the second phase adding illusory copies of the monk to fight. Honestly, just grapple around the treetops surrounding the bridge until she gives up or something. The third phase has its movements influenced by the centipede, much like the Guardian Ape's second phase. This is followed by the Fountainhead Palace, one of the most beautiful locations in any FromSoft game, nay, any game, period. Thankfully, there's plenty of things to do here, so you have an excuse to take it all in. Which is good, because this scenery is a gift from God. Literally. There's a guy who wants to turn himself into an immortal fish, a lady who wants you to liberate her father from feeding said immortal fish, and much more. The enemies also really like lightning. Like, a lot. This is capped off by the Divine Dragon fight, which has to be one of the best spectacle bosses ever devised by From Software. It's a gimmick fight for sure, but it's still more mechanically interesting and visually rewarding than something like Yorm or the King of Storms, but hey, that's subjective. You don't kill the dragon either, you just use the mortal blade to get some of its tears. You then return to find Ishin dead in Ashina Castle. Wolf tracks down Kuro, who is standing before Genichiro, in the same place that you fought him at the beginning of the game. Wolf draws his sword, quickly and smoothly with the prowess of a true shinobi. Now, I don't want to speak for everybody who's played this game, but I find that at this point, with this being the 3rd time you fought Genichiro, this is the easiest his fight has been in the game. He has the Black Mortal Blade, which adds a couple slashes, but all they really do is let you smack his ass a few times for free. Once you finish curb stomping him, he uses the Black Mortal Blade to cut open his neck and open a gateway to the underworld to bring back his recently deceased grandfather Ishin Ashina to fight you. This comes out of nowhere. The Black Mortal Blade was never really explained, nor its power to breach the barriers between life and death. Ishin dying right before this is definitely done to make this fight possible, and why he fights you is still a little murky. Yes, I know the thing about it being his grandson's dying request and all, but it's still eh. However, any problems I would have with the writing reasons are dashed to pieces by how fucking awesome this fight is. This is the best final boss of any FromSoft game, and it's not even close. Ishin himself has 3 phases, and with Genichiro beforehand, that makes this a 4-phase boss. And this is Ishin in his prime. If you choose the bad ending by obeying the Iron Code earlier on in the game and forsaking Kuro, the version of Ishin you fight there is an old man with 1 arm. But this is Ishin in his prime, in his youth. He goes from using a sword to a giant spear to a Glock for some reason. His final phase incorporates lightning reversals, which ironically make it the easiest of the 3 phases. The last phase is more about the spectacle anyway. After this, Sekiro kills him. When he goes to Kuro, the Divine Heir implores Wolf to use the Mortal Blade to kill him, thereby severing the dragon's heritage and releasing the land from the curse of immortality. Wolf is apprehensive. He hesitates. He didn't hesitate to kill Ishin, he didn't hesitate to kill his mentor, Lady Butterfly, and he didn't hesitate to kill his adopted father, Owl. But he hesitates to kill his master, who he is completely loyal to. The one person who genuinely cared for him is also the last person he has to kill to end this. In the end, his loyalty is unshaken, and he ends Kuro with the mortal blade. We then see Wolf, doing as the sculptor did, carving Buddhas to stave off the fires of Shura. Fires of Shura consume those who are too bloodthirsty for battle, or seemingly warriors who lost something of great importance. The sculptor lost his partner, a woman named Kingfisher, and Wolf lost Kuro. Emma brings Wolf the prosthetic arm to pass on to whatever forlorn shinobi might happen upon it. Now, this ending is depressing to say the least, especially when you consider that in this ending, Kuro partially failed. He did succeed in severing the dragon's heritage, but he failed in stopping the violence. Wolf will one day be consumed by Shura. No matter how many Buddha statues he carves, it will consume him. In an odd way, in the ending where you kill Kuro, Kuro is also the only person you're really able to save. There are 4 endings in Sekiro, one of which is the default, which I just talked about. Another is the Shura ending, which I mentioned earlier. It's the easiest ending to obtain, and it contains a final boss that's far easier than Ishin. Well, it is Ishin, but it's an easier version of him. Narratively, this ending is the path of least resistance, and the game's mechanics support this. In another ending, it becomes possible to sever the dragon's heritage by killing one with the dragon's blood, but it doesn't have to be Kuro. In this ending, to spare both Kuro and the rest of the land from the cursed immortality of the dragon's blood, Wolf need only end himself, and this time, he doesn't hesitate. The 4th ending is also the most dubious. The divine child of the rejuvenating waters offers you an alternative, saying that the divine dragon must be returned to its home in the west. She takes Kuro and absorbs his essence, I think. Then her and Wolf depart for the west to return the divine dragon home. You won't get this ending without a guide, and I am not that guide. It also would, in my opinion, be the perfect setup for a sequel. Come on, FromSoft, please. Although I do acknowledge that that would defeat the whole any ending can be canon if you want it to be thing that FromSoft seems to love so much. So there you have it. And what do we say? What is there to say? Well, I'll start. I didn't preface this video with my feelings about this game because I didn't want to color my admittedly primitive analysis of this game with how I felt about it. Since that's over, here you go. Sekiro is my favorite game of all time, and when it comes to my favorite game of all time, I'm about as consistent as a random number generator in that I'm only consistent in being inconsistent. But I mean, come on, Sekiro? The fast-paced and rewarding combat and the ludonarrative harmony created by said combat, the character-driven story in which the player's desire for compassion can create it, and the beautiful areas that complement the game's dynamic movement system. This is one of the most perfect games I've ever played. Want to know my biggest problem with this game? You can't disable the tutorial pop-ups. Yeah, you know when you pick up an item and a message shows you and tells you what the item does? Yeah, that is genuinely my biggest problem with this game. And the artistry and uniqueness of this game, while being the reason I love it, is also the reason why it's forgotten. I'm not saying that absolutely nobody talks about it, of course not. There are plenty of videos on this game that are better than this one that you should probably watch. But it doesn't get the same attention as games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and especially not Elden Ring. And why? Well, I have a guess. Think of popular music, especially nowadays. The charts aren't topped by being unique or artistic or weird. They're topped by being formulaic. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that all the top artists are the same because they're not the same in the same way that all Call of Duty titles aren't the same. They look different, they sound different, but they don't feel different. Sekiro feels different. It's unique, it's weird, it's artistic, and because of that, it had the impact of a game that is all of those things. It had the impact of a game that isn't for everyone, and that's okay. That's what Demon Souls had, but that was necessary so Dark Souls could shine brighter. Because every dark side of the moon needs its Piper at the gates of dawn. Many Pink Floyd fans have never listened to Piper at the Gates of Dawn, aside from maybe hearing Interstellar Overdrive and Doctor Strange. And I'm sure many Elden Ring players have never played Sekiro, and yet both the Pink Floyd fans and the Elden Ring players wouldn't exist without these things that they know nothing about. FromSoft is willing to take these risks and go outside of what is potentially going to be popular because they know that in the end, they'll be rewarded for learning from that experience. Whether they deviate heavily from their safe but spectacular formula or stick to their guns when it goes against the grain, they don't hesitate because they know very well that hesitation is defeat.